Broadcasting from Manhattan Beach and the World Wide Web, you're listening to CHSR, HealthyLife.net.
As a service to our listeners, this program is for general information and entertainment purposes only. CHSR, HealthyLife.net does not recommend, endorse, or object to the views, products, or topics expressed or discussed by show hosts or their guests. We suggest you always consult with your own personal, medical, financial, or legal advisor.
Autism with Dr. Andy, and today's guest, Dr. KathyMarshack, from what I've read here, is an absolutely fascinating lady and professional, written a number of books. We're going to talk mostly about her book called Going Over the Edge. Also, I'll try to work in Out of Mind, Out of Sight, and When Empathy Fails. So, welcome, Dr. Marshack.
Thank you, Andy. It's good to talk with you.
Great. Oh, my pleasure. So, Dr. Marshack, let's take a look at what brought you to be doing all these wonderful things you're doing. It's not in your talking points, which we will go over, but our audience usually likes to know a little bit about the author. So could you give us a little bit of your background and what brought you to be this wonderful writer that you are?
That's really sweet. It's pretty easy for me. I am a psychologist, but like any mother with an autistic child, that didn't really help. I didn't even recognize her autism until she was 13. Very bright, very capable young lady, and she's all grown up now. But it was a puzzle to me. And I went to graduate school before we even had the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism or any of that. And so it took a while. But once I discovered it, I began to want to know more, want to learn more. And in that process of learning more about my daughter, other members of my family, I said, I've got to write about this, in particular for the non-spectrum family members. That's what my book is aimed toward, those people who love their family members, but they're struggling with how to cope with their spectrum, loved ones.
And this is it's not just interesting, it's also so important, because many times we talk about the child or teenager, young adult, who is on the spectrum, but we don't talk about the impact on the family and talk about things that might be important for the family to know when interacting that would be helpful, because it's so easy to do things that are not helpful. So I'm just delighted to have you on. So let's talk just a bit about you and it's your daughter, and how she changed your life.
How she changed my life? Oh, absolutely. And you're also talking about the focus of my book being about helping families cope with this, because one of the side effects of dealing with a child like mine was to doubt myself, to wonder what I was doing wrong. And I was doing things wrong, it's true, but as a parent, but I also was not, if you come from that loving place and you keep trying to figure out how to connect with this other person, there's ways to do that. But when I didn't understand what it was very frustrating. It was also frustrating to go to professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, special ed teachers, special ed counselors, and not one of them get what I was talking about, because the emphasis was very much on dealing with the autistic person, not necessarily the non-spectrum parent, or in my case also a spouse, before, and I believe my mother was on the spectrum, although that's, post-mortem diagnosis. But I think I grew up trying to understand my mother, too. So my daughter really helped me to look at, oh, wait a minute, there might be other things that are being communicated here through her behaviors and her language and her interests than I was able to understand when I was trying to look at it from my frame of reference. I needed to understand her mind. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I've had so many really interesting people on the show. Like I had Ron Kaufman on, who they wrote Sunrise about. He was one of the first books that came out on autism many years ago. And he talks about this and what his parents did for him and the importance of understanding what's going on with them, which is very foreign than what's going on with the neurotypical person. So I see your work as being important, very important.
Well, I appreciate that. When I do have, I have both spectrum and non-spectrum people in my office as a clinician, and I think both sides feel really understood because I take the time to look at how that person is expressing themselves. And I'm always teaching my clients, please trust that the other person means well, even if their behavior is odd.
I do. And, as supported by some of my other guests I've had on, Elaine Hall, the lady out in California who started the Miracle Project, she talked about her work with her son and how it really all, her awareness came about as a result of her getting into his world and understanding where he is coming from. And I had as well Mary Romaniak on, who wrote Victory Over Autism. Again, the same kind of thing. So I think it's important what you're doing because you're providing answers that would not be typically out there because most of us don't or can't think like someone on the spectrum. So good stuff. And you said something else which I'm going to bring up. In your book, Going Over the Edge, you talk about life with a partner or spouse with Asperger's syndrome. And that's, to me, is fascinating because I've never heard anything done on that. So we're going to get to all of this as we unfold. I'd like to go back to something, though, Dr. Marshack, and that is you had mentioned earlier that you believe your post-mortem here, that your mom was on the spectrum. Can you give us a little idea of what gave you those thoughts?
Yeah, it started actually when my older daughter was younger and taught herself to read and carried books with her everywhere, even as a 5-year-old. And I said, you are just like my mother. You are exactly like my mother. And my mother had passed away before I adopted my daughter. And I said, so you must just be my mother reincarnated. And so after looking back on that later, realizing that my mother had many of the same traits as my daughter, but yet they couldn't be related, right, because my daughter's adopted, I realized that, that's why Mom said and did some of the things she did. That's why she had meltdowns. Sometimes she would have some terrible meltdowns and be so distraught. My mother was also had to spend time in a state mental hospital. So because nobody recognized at the time that it was probably autism that was causing the distress and her chronic depression. So there's some tragedy back there, but at the same time, looking at the way Mom said and did things, she was extremely concerned about my welfare. She wanted me to eat healthy food. She wanted me to... I couldn't dress in any synthetic fibers. Mom was concerned about the damage to my body as a child. She was very concerned about that. And yet, if I woke up in the middle of the night with an illness and I went to my mom for comfort, she'd take my temperature and she said, yes, you've got a fever. Go back to bed and get some sleep. It was more matter of fact, and I didn't understand that was her way of saying she was caring for me.
Yeah.
So there was these kind of confusing things that going on, you know, and when I would give her a hug, she would hug me back. But it wasn't like the recognizing that, you know, give me a hug or put me on her lap and say, yeah, I know you don't feel well, honey. If I said I didn't feel well, she would say, you're right, it doesn't feel good. So she was able to do it in response to me, but not generate it, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, I was looking at one of your books, I can't remember which one now, but you had the Chinese symbol for crisis, which is danger and opportunity. And as I'm just reflecting now on what you said about your mom, that crisis, mom being on the spectrum and also being in a hospital, that crisis probably made you who you are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had to get to the bottom of it. And it's why I'm a psychologist, I'm sure. No, I mean, and I was the oldest child as well in the family. And so I do remember I was 14 when my mom went to the mental hospital. And I did take my responsibility very seriously. I took care of my little sister. I did what I could as a 14-year-old, right? I couldn't do everything, but I did my best. And one of the things I always excelled at was doing well in school. So I just got straight A's. It didn't necessarily help the family, but at least my father wasn't worried that I was going to somehow disintegrate under all that pressure.
You know, and as I was looking at going over the edge, and your husband was on the spectrum, correct?
Well, I'm not allowed to diagnose him, and my daughter was diagnosed
let me
by other
redirect
professionals.
that.
So he hasn't been formally diagnosed.
Okay. Let me redirect that. It would appear that some of the behaviors or symptoms expressed by your former husband were in some ways similar to your mother's. Is that correct?
I think they are very similar, yes. And I think that that's a reason that the title of that first book is Going Over the Edge. I have so many of my non-spectrum spouses say they can relate to that title, and because it starts with the frustration and the hurt and the dismay and all of that. But then as a wife myself, not able to get what was going on at first, and an understanding, it felt like I was in a war zone. Looking back, though, after quite a few years, I realized that I was misunderstanding a lot of the messages that were being sent. That I was reading it the way a non-spectrum or neurotypical would look at it, and I was making mistakes. But I still don't. You still have to forgive yourself and carry on and figure out what to do forward.
Well, Dr. Marshack, especially since when in retrospect we see that we do tend to gravitate in some ways, many of us do anyway, to folks who have characteristics of one of our parents. And my suspicion, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that there was something about your husband that may have been part of your past, behavior you saw and felt comfortable with.
Oh, yeah, I don't mind talking about that at all. My mother was brilliant. My former husband is brilliant. They are quirky, and it's kind of endearing. My mother taught me so many things that because of her ability to hyper-focus, she was passionate about healthcare, food, lots of things. She loved astronomy. There's all kinds of things that she was passionate about. So that even today, if I'm driving through farm country, I can probably name the crops because my mother knew those things and would teach them to me. Wow. But she also read voraciously, and my former husband's the same. Really brilliant, many things that he knows. He taught me lots of things. He was also really amusing. He told a great joke. And I felt like I'm sure they were similar in many ways. The pattern is what I talk about in my books, though, because the expression is once you've met an autistic person, you've met one autistic person, not just one person, right? But there are patterns. There are definitely patterns there. And those patterns are what befuddle the rest of us.
Yeah, and you know, I'm thinking as you're chatting with me, and I'm thinking of a book on patterns. And I'm sure it's out there somewhere. Well, I shouldn't say that. I'm not sure it is. But it would be an interesting book, and if somebody's done it, and you know about it, enlighten me. But it'd be an interesting book to see on patterns of autistic thought.
Yes.
And I'd like to see, and maybe that has to be done by an autistic person. I don't know. But it would seem like they'd be the best at doing it.
It might be. It might be. I don't know if you recall one of the stories that I wrote about with my daughter when she was in second grade. I did the usual mom thing, and I said, "So how was school today, honey?" And she said, "Well, we studied patterns." And I said, now remember, she's 7, right? And I said, "Oh, well, what is that about?" And she looked at me like, "You're asking a dumb question," but I didn't know what she meant. And she goes, "Well, we studied patterns in math." And I said, "Oh," I still wasn't sure what the heck she was talking about, because when I was in second grade, I don't remember studying patterns. But she identified it, and I don't know if the teacher called them patterns or not. But and I said, "Well, could you tell me more?" And she said, "Okay, Mom, it's like this. You're a psychologist, right?" And I said, "Yes," still puzzled. And she goes, "You study patterns in people, right?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she's 7 and observing this in me.
Oh, my. Wow, wow, wow.
And I said, "Oh," and she said, "So we studied patterns in math today." And I said, "I got it. Okay." Now, what a perfect example.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah, it's great.
But
she taught me a lot. I mean,
it's
amazing to me that people on the spectrum really are such great observers of human behavior and yet still struggle interacting with others.
Yeah, well, it is so fascinating, and something you said earlier fascinated me as well, and that is that your husband, with many of those characteristics we've discussed, was a great joke teller. That's the first time I've ever heard of someone with Asperger characteristics being good at telling jokes. Never heard it before.
Because he understands the patterns.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Now, what's interesting, though, is I can also tell you that he would not always be able to understand if somebody else was telling the joke because of that theory of mind issue. But if he's telling the joke, he knows the pattern, he knows what punchlines will produce laughter, he understands human behavior in a certain way, but it's not the same as putting himself into the mind of the other person.
Dr. Marshack, just for our listeners who may not know, theory of mind is the ability to put oneself in, so to speak, the shoes of another person, but to be thinking what that other person might be thinking. And that's, as you just underlined for me there, that's a typical characteristic of folks on the spectrum, that their theory of mind weakness is that they can't consider what you're probably thinking. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because that's a really important concept. So here he is. He can tell a great joke, but he can go through all of the intricacies that a good joke teller can do without thinking, but yet still doesn't get what's going on with you. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, it's a dilemma, but it is something I try to encourage my spectrum people to think about.
Yeah. And, you know, when you talk, you've got me thinking now, because this idea of patterns, and I hadn't thought about that word before, but patterns are in everything, you know, from math to the universe to human relations to everything. There are patterns. And, you know, I know I'm repeating myself, but I'd really love to see a book done on patterns of autistic thought, realizing that every one of them is individual, they're all different, but it would be fun to kind of learn more about that. What's your thought on that?
Well, and expand upon that skill. we've got a lot of information about really brilliant people on the spectrum who use their ability to see the pattern in things that the rest of us aren't noticing, and so they develop a new cure for some illness, or sell short and save money on the stock market crashing. So if we understand that concept, we might be able to teach people to use patterns more efficiently in ways where they don't have a theory of mind.
There's probably a whole book on Undone for any of my listeners who want to do it, or maybe you'll do it, Dr. Marshack. Patterns.
I made a note just now.
Yeah.
I like that idea.
Yeah, patterns for autistic people in terms of how they look at music, how they look at relationships, how they look at math, how they look at science, how they look at everything, because I'm resonating to something you said earlier, and that is the people who make the new discoveries are always doing so outside the box. They don't think like everybody else, or if they did, they wouldn't be finding these new discoveries. So that may also be an item for thought about, suppose you had a school for folks who were Asperger, and you looked at, and it was a school for really brilliant Asperger people, and looked at the different areas of ability that they have, like we talk math, science, music, art, whatever, and then help them to enhance whatever innate ability they have, to really do things that are world-changing. Wouldn't that be interesting?
Yes, and the other piece of this is that part of that theory of mind issue and empathy, being able to communicate to the other person what's going on in their mind, many people on the spectrum see the pattern, understand the pattern. They don't know they're supposed to tell us about it. They don't know they're supposed to write about it. They don't think it's exceptional. Or they may even have, depending on the sensory sensitivity or the neurological issues that's going on with them, they may not, it just may take them a while to figure it out, right? So I would love to have a way to help them express those patterns so that the rest of us can benefit. At the very least, understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, and as we're chatting, I'm also taking notes and thinking that this is such a virgin territory, the kinds of things that you and I are talking about. I'm sure someone else has thought of it as well. Usually they do. But I just haven't seen it yet. And I like that idea of a school for these folks, kind of like an academy-type person where they could really take their challenge and make it into an opportunity that could benefit mankind. Dr. Marshack, we have to take a short commercial break. Before we do, I would like to thank a couple of people for their help. One is Kimberly Hansen from the Asperger's and Autism and Asperger's Publishing Company, who was kind enough to set up our chat today, Dr. Marshack. And also, I'd like to thank Neil Maroney and Glenn Wilhelm from the group that makes Ion Cleanse, a foot bath that removes heavy metals from your body, and highly recommended by many of the folks on the show. And the name of that company is A Major Difference, and we'll be right back.
We're living in the most polluted environment in Earth's known history, with continuous exposure to petrochemicals, pesticides, and other harmful toxins. The Ion Cleanse by AMD is a safe, gentle detoxification method with a proven effective 15-year history. Visit amajordifference.com to learn about Ion Cleanse and their 60-day 100% guarantee. That's amajordifference.com, or call 303-755-0112, extension 103. AMajorDifference.com.
HealthyLife.net, the positive radio network.
Hi, folks. This is Autism with Dr. Andy. Today's guest, Dr. Kathy Marshack. is the author of a number of books. We're going to chat about all of them by the end of the talk today. But I'd like to go over the first one I have here, Going Over the Edge, Life with a Partner or Spouse with Asperger's Syndrome. Dr. Marshack, talk to us about this book. Talk to us about what brought it up, and then I want to get into some of the suggestions you have as a result of the book.
Sure. Actually, I wrote the book because it occurred to me that I couldn't be alone. I couldn't be the only neurotypical or non-spectrum person living with an adult on the spectrum or having grown up with an adult on the spectrum. And there had to be others that were experiencing the confusion and stress and heartbreak sometimes of trying to communicate with your autistic loved ones. And so I tentatively wrote the book, shipped it out to a couple of publishers as a, to see if they were interested. And then, as you know, Autism Asperger Publishing Company picked it up. It has been amazing to me to find out that I have people reading this book all over the world. And it's not translated into all these languages. It's only in English. But literally on every continent, I have people who purchased the book. And they write to me, and we actually have a online support group as well. But it's discovering that there is something more that we can do to make these relationships work better has been a relief to a lot of my readers.
Wow, what a wonderful story. How about that? Here you are with no idea that your words are going to help people all over the world. You didn't start out with that. Of course, you always hope for that. But what a wonderful story that you've had this impact.
Well, what I did was after I wrote the book, I set up a group here in Portland where I live, and I just let the word out that if anybody wanted to come and talk, I'd try to meet once a month or so. And so the word went out through meetup.com. I set up a meetup group. And so I'd have 5 people, 10 people. So I think we had as many as 30 one time for lunch. And then I started getting messages from people from other towns, cities, countries, saying, could we join your group? And I said, well, you'd have to come to Portland. And they said, no, could you do a video call or a teleconference or whatever? So I started opening it up that way, and now we have 2,500 members around the world.
Isn't that wonderful?
For these talks.
What a great story.
It's stunning. I had no idea. I didn't even know how to set up a video call. I'm a psychologist. What do I know?
Well, sometimes that's the best thing, is to not know and just let it unfold.
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Marshack, let's chat a bit about this book. Tell our listeners what they need to know about your book, Going Over the Edge. Give them some of the suggestions and ideas that will give them the help they need. Well,
I'm going to start kind of on a negative note because that's where people are coming from when they're hurting. So that's why I entitled the book Going Over the Edge. It feels like you're going over the edge, like you're just desperate and depressed and angry and hurt and confused about these relationships because your partner is a really bright, capable person, but it feels like they don't connect with you emotionally. So right now I'm speaking to the non-spectrum person. We're used to connecting with other people in a chit-chat, a little non-empathic way, an eyebrow raise, something like that. And so what I tell people in the book is that, unfortunately, your autistic family member, it makes you feel unloved, unappreciated, not respected. Some people even feel verbally abused. And when you tear it apart, when you break it down into chunks, it isn't always intended that way. And the sad thing for people on the spectrum is that they are often accused of these things, of being rude, thoughtless, and even abusive. And so I start from helping people recognize that they're not alone in feeling that way. It's normal to feel abused when your Asperger mate forgets your birthday or doesn't sign the card they bought for you, or these kind of things are normal reactions, but it comes from separating. The spectrum person separates intent from behavior. They know how they feel. They know they care about you. They're not recognizing, because of that theory of mind problem, they're not recognizing how you need to feel, how you need to hear it, how you need to be approached. They just figure because I mean well, that should be good enough. So that's a big start. Once people get past being angry and realize that it's a communication error, not personal, then we can start trying to understand better where your Asperger partner is coming from. I don't know if that makes sense. That's a big chunk.
Oh, it does, Dr. Marshack. And if I may just interrupt for a moment, what flashed into my mind was the scene from Good Will Hunting when Robin Williams says to the main character, and he says, it's not your fault. And then he says, oh, no, it's not my fault. No, it's not your fault. Because the main character, whose name is eluding me right now, and Damon. What's Damon's first name?
Matt Damon.
Matt Damon.
Yeah, that's the actor. I don't know what his character name was, though.
Yeah, but Matt Damon, who's a genius, an off-the-chart genius, has those issues because of terrible things that happened to him as a child, but I suspect there also might have been other things going on. And what flashed in my mind was that, you know, it's not your fault that just like Matt Damon, who was doing all these bizarre things and couldn't connect with people, and was hiding parts of his life and blah, 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 that the genius of the writer was to say it's not your fault. Probably the most emotional scene in that whole movie. It's not your fault. And I'm thinking that with so many of our folks on the spectrum, especially those with Asperger's syndrome, it's not their fault. And that might be the title of another book you'll do called It's Not Their Fault.
Well, you know, I intended the book for the non-spectrum person, but I probably get as many emails from people on the spectrum who've read the book and will tell me how helpful it was to understand their non-spectrum family members, their husband, their wife, their child, their parent. They realized that it wasn't anybody's fault. It's nobody's fault. It's the non-spectrum person has to stop blaming themselves or blaming their partner, and vice versa. We just need to understand the pattern.
That is such a simple yet critical component of this whole puzzle. The fact that it's not their fault, it's not your fault, it just is. Because, you know, so many parents blame themselves for their child's condition, and they beat themselves up the rest of their lives, saying I should have done this or I could have done that or whatever, and that seeing it as their fault takes away the energy and the opportunity to make it different.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, blaming and shaming are a huge waste of time, and they're mean. So let's not do that mean stuff to ourselves or to the other person. But without, a translation of what's going on here, I get why both sides can go there. You know, so confusing. What on earth is my Asperger mate saying when they say nothing? Or they get angry and I'm not complaining.
Yeah. Dr. Marshack, I'm going to take another short commercial break. The time is just flying by. We have 2 8-minute segments left. And once again, I'd like to thank Kimberly Hansen from the Autism and Asperger's Publishing Company for setting up our authors to come on my show. And also to thank the folks from A Major Difference, the makers of Ion Cleanse, the foot bath that draws heavy metals out of the body and has been used successfully by many of the folks on this show. Many of the moms have used it with their children. We'll be right back.
We're living in the most polluted environment in Earth's known history, with continuous exposure to petrochemicals, pesticides, and other harmful toxins. The Ion Cleanse by AMD is a safe, gentle detoxification method with a proven effective 15-year history. Visit amajordifference.com to learn about Ion Cleanse and their 60-day 100% guarantee. That's amajordifference.com or call 303-755-0112, extension 103. AMajorDifference.com.
Where positive people and radio unite. HealthyLife.net.
Hi, folks. This is Autism with Dr. Andy. Today's guest, Dr. KathyMarshack, is the author of a number of books. Right now we're discussing going over the edge. And so welcome back, Dr. Marshack.
Thank you. I'm enjoying the conversation.
Oh, me too. It's so much fun. I'm very delighted and blessed that I can work on this program. It's just such fun. So let's get back to our folks and the information in going over the edge. And give us some more of your insights that will be helpful.
Well, like I said before, basically stop the blame and the shame and realize that there's just a miscommunication going on here. And if you can get into the mind of your Asperger family member, it really helps. Many of my Asperger clients will say, yeah, well, actually, my daughter said this, too. It was really cute. She said, Mom, why don't people say what they mean? Why don't they say what they mean? And I said, oh, dear, you're right about that. People do say what they mean, but there are as many ways they do it. And linguists know this. We have a tone of voice, the choice of words we make, the synchrony, the asynchrony in our speech. All that nonverbal behavior is also a method that we're communicating, which makes it very difficult for Asperger folks to get what's going on there. So I tried to teach her how to ask questions, so it's another tip. Don't give up. Just politely ask for more information so that you kind of know what people are talking about. And then the other thing she would say to me is, Mom, I wish people could just know what's going on in my mind so I didn't have to explain it. So again, there's that disconnect for people on the spectrum is how do I explain what's going on with me when I think I am, but other people just don't get it. So we need to build, another one of my clients, software engineer, he said we need to build an interface protocol between your CPU and mine, my wife's CPU. So he was recognizing that the information is being processed differently, and it's just not coming out the same way for both people. So,
and Dr. Marshack, I'm coming back to something, and what
Sure.
you just said to me just reinforced this whole idea of patterns with your software person, that each of the spouses have a pattern, and the neurotypical doesn't understand the pattern of the spectrum person, and vice versa. And so that's actually not a bad idea. That gentleman who said, we need to interface in some way. And here's another book for you. I think we've got about 4 more books for you to do right there.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, let me.
I'd like to bring something
go ahead.
else
Go
up.
ahead.
And what it is that when you said, why don't people say what they think? One of the, I don't know if you've ever watched The Good Doctor.
Yeah.
On TV.
Mm-hmm.
The story about a surgeon who was an Asperger person.
Right.
Well, I actually had one of the people on the show. I'm friendly with Elaine Hall, who developed the Miracle Project out in California. And I was going to have her on the show, and she couldn't make it, so she gave me a young man who was actually on the TV show with Dr. Sean, and he talked about what it's like to be an Asperger actor. But what I wanted to mention, and the point of this long-winded talk here from me, is that Sean, Dr. Sean, the gifted surgeon, said to one of his colleagues who was his supervisor, he said, do you know you're very arrogant? And, of course, that's a typical Aspie kind of thing where you're not allowed to say to your supervisor, you're arrogant. And what resonated where that came from is that your daughter's saying, why don't people say what they think? And they don't say what they think because they're afraid of the repercussions. And this is the last thread on that whole thought, which is the opposite of how sociopaths think. You know, sociopaths are so cunning that they tell you what you want to hear and not what the truth is. So it's almost like it goes from one end of the spectrum, like a sociopath who has no concern, just wants to manipulate you, and the other end of the spectrum is a person who is just letting it out without any boundary. Kind of fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's why I came up with the concept of empathy dysfunction. I would call the sociopath, for example, I identify them as EMD, that's my shorthand for it, EMD1. They do have empathy, some. They're very good at figuring you out and telling you exactly what you want to hear, but they have no conscience, so that part of the empathy is not working. They're not screening for how they would feel should you do this to them. They're not doing that at all. They don't care, and they're trying to harm you. They're out to hurt you, but they do figure you out pretty well. Whereas
I know it has nothing to do with autism. Let's talk about this for a minute. It's so fascinating.
Sure.
I can't pass it up.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I said, let's talk about that empathy issue. It's so fascinating, I can't pass it up. It has nothing to do with autism, but maybe it does. But tell me more about that. I know you've done another book called When Empathy Fails. Give us a little insight into that.
You know, I do think it has to do with autism. And when I walk my autistic clients through that, I say, you've got to understand, without a theory of mind, when there's a weakness, maybe not without, but, you know, when there's a weakness in that area, then all the empathy points aren't working. You may be sensitive. You may be picking up what the other person is feeling. But, like my daughter said, why don't people say what they think? If what neurotypicals are doing is screening out certain things, depending on what they think you need to know or how you're going to feel about it, and you're not very good at picking up what they're screening out, then the empathy process isn't working fully. We have to reduce anxiety with my clients. You know, when you reduce anxiety, when you clean up depression, when you restore people's faith in themselves, empathy improves. So I do think it has to do with the shame and blame cycle that we see with people on the spectrum and with people who live with them. And I think it goes for different reasons. So that's how I would talk about it, and that's what I did in my book, When Empathy Fails. I was focusing primarily on those kind of folks who are trying to harm you, but I do have a chapter about my daughter and how empathy failed her too, a little bit differently though, because she's a kind person, she's a good heart, she's very creative and talented, and she would never want to harm anybody. But the idea though is that she would say things sometimes that were harmful, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This is kind of a different look at autism that is typical from the shows I do, but I'm enjoying it very much. And Dr. Marshack, one more commercial break, and then we'll do our last segment. Again, I'd like to thank Kimberly Hansen from the Autism and Asperger's Publishing Company for setting today's meeting up. And also thank the folks from A Major Difference, the makers of Ion Cleanse, Neil Maroney, and Glenn Wilhelm. We'll be right back.
We're living in the most polluted environment in Earth's known history, with continuous exposure to petrochemicals, pesticides, and other harmful toxins. The Ion Cleanse by AMD is a safe, gentle detoxification method with a proven effective 15-year history. Visit amajordifference.com to learn about Ion Cleanse and their 60-day 100% guarantee. That's amajordifference.com or call 303-755-0112, extension 103. amajordifference.com.
Where positive people and radio unite. HealthyLife.net.
Hi, folks. This is Autism with Dr. Andy. Today's guest, Dr. DrKathyMarshack, the author of a number of books. We started talking about her book, Going Over the Edge, Life with a Partner or Spouse with Asperger's Syndrome. We're also chatting a little bit about When Empathy Fails, another one of her books. And she has another book here called Out of Mind, Out of Sight, Parenting with a Partner with Asperger's Syndrome. And let's talk let me do this, because there's so many things I could ask, and I'll miss the mark. Dr. Marshack, we only have 8 minutes left. So let me give the show over to you. You talk about what remains unsaid. That is important.
Yes, what remains unsaid.
What do you want to tell our listeners?
Well, since the last book you mentioned was about parenting with a partner on the spectrum, if you think about it, parenting requires all the time getting into the mind of your child, understanding their developmental stage, recognizing that they don't always make sense to you, but they make sense to them. And so if you're also trying to parent with a partner on the spectrum, you're having to get into their mind and understand what's going on with them, because the spectrum person has a harder time getting into your mind. They may read your external behavior. They may know a lot about you because they've lived with you. They may have facts about you. But that doesn't mean that in this moment in time they can understand the nuance of the communication. And so parenting is a lot. I remember when my daughter came to me one day, she was about 3, and she said, "Mommy, my neck's too tight." This is my autistic child. She said, "Mommy, my neck's too tight." And I said, "Oh, honey, do you need to change your T-shirt? Is the T-shirt too small? The neck's tight?" And she said, No, my neck's too tight. And I stopped for a minute, and I said, "Okay, is it too tight on the inside?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Is it hard to swallow?" "Yes." And I said, "Oh, we call that a sore throat." And said, "Let Mommy see if I can help you with that." But, yeah, and that's what parenting is, even when you're talking to a teenager. It really is. They don't always have the language for everything. But the autistic child isn't necessarily learning from the social world. They're not picking up that it's a throat on the inside and it's a neck on the outside.
That's a great example. Great example. And that was really cool the way you thought of it in a different way. That was a great parenting move there. And I like also, let's talk about this for a minute. It's like dealing with a teenager. Chaim Gnat had said that having a teenager is like setting to sail in storm. There's no way you come out of it unscathed. So even when we have typical teenagers, it ain't easy. So
right.
Let's talk about that a little bit, too.
Well, I was going to compare my 2 children because both of my kids are adopted. They're not biologically related in any way. And my non-spectrum child would be so confused by her sister because she'd want to play with her. And sometimes Bianca would play with Phoebe, and sometimes she wasn't the least bit interested, and that's normal sibling stuff. But the younger child, I could just assume that she would get my meaning when I'd say, sometimes she wants to play with you. It's not personal. Find something else to do. And she could be okay with that. She still might have her feelings hurt, and they certainly played together at times. But my older daughter on the spectrum was perfectly fine hanging out in her room, listening to her music, playing on the computer. She could be by herself for hours. She never reached out to anybody to play with them. If another child asked to play with her, or if as a teenager she might be invited over to a sleepover or something like that, she would decline to go. She would be worried about all that social interaction. And in fact, we had a sleepover for her birthday when she was like 14 or 15, 14 I think. And so a number of kids came, but my daughter let them watch movies, and she went into her room and read.
Wow.
Whereas my younger teenager, there was no way that was going to happen. You know, she was social. She wanted to be with friends. And as she got older, of course, hanging out with Mom at Mom's house was not at all on her list. She wanted to be anywhere but at home. Right. Whereas my older daughter needed the comfort of those surroundings. Mom was a stable force for her. So does that make sense? There's very different development going on with a teenager on the spectrum. Right.
Yeah, great example. And I'm so glad
but
you brought
again,
it up.
parenting these two children is very difficult. It makes you kind of crazy. And then if you've got a co-parent who's on the spectrum, they may not understand these normal developmental stages.
You know, Dr. Marshack, as you just added that other component of the equation, the spouse on the spectrum, the feeling I got in my body was exhaustion. Because here you are trying to figure out two different puzzles and how to explain one puzzle to the other puzzle. And right. I just think, oh my goodness, wow, that's a tough one.
Well, you know, many of the members in my group for the neurotypical spouse, they report that exhaustion, and I certainly felt it too. Many of them have, various immunodeficiency illnesses because of the stress chemicals pumping to their body year after year. I certainly know I got sick many, many times because I was just tired. So it's an emotional fatigue, if that makes sense. It's not necessarily, you're doing plenty as a parent anyway. You're busy running around and falling asleep in the car while the kid's in with their piano lesson. But the emotional the fatigue is intense, and we need help for that. We need understanding.
Dr. Marshack, you probably know this already, but maybe our listeners don't. They say that many of the moms who have a kid on the spectrum are experiencing PTSD similar to folks coming back from the military in war zones.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's why I refer to it as a war zone, even dealing with a spouse on the spectrum. Why would it be any different with the spouse than it is with the child on the spectrum? Right. And it might even be worse in a way because you're expecting your spouse to function like you do, be able to parent like you do or communicate like you do. And they may be highly functional, very successful people out there in the work world, and they come home and they don't communicate well with you. So I think it's a double stressor.
And I agree, and I'm kind of rephrasing that in my mind, and I'm thinking, how do you explain someone who you don't understand, the child, to an adult who you don't understand? Wow. That's just the thought of that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
It's pretty tough.
Yeah. To me, it's near impossible. But I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, which I think is so important. And, sometimes you just trip over things, and there are manifestations that occur kind of serendipitously. But that pattern thing, I'd like to find out if that's possible, to find patterns of thinking with people on the spectrum and try to relate those to neurotypicals so that they can understand what's going on better. And
Well, I have a couple of tips.
I'm sorry, you go ahead.
I was going to say, I have a couple of tips. One is to, whenever your autistic family member confuses you, I want you to say to yourself that makes perfect sense to them.
Yes.
It makes perfect sense to them, and then try to ask yourself, what does that mean? You know, what does it mean to them? It may not mean the same to you, but what does it mean to them? That really helps a lot. And if you can do that, if you can stay out of the feeling threatened, hurt, confused, overwhelmed, or whatever, it really helps. But I also remind my neurotypicals that probably the burden belongs on your shoulders, because the neurotypical does have a theory of mind. It is easier.
Yeah.
But you can't expect the other person to do it your way. You know, that's like kind of a waste of time. And it's also, it's not personal. It's not you. There's just a misunderstanding. Step out of the picture. Look for the pattern. Look for the pattern in their communication. How does it make perfect sense to them? And then try to speak to their intention, not the gummed-up presentation. So when my daughter said her neck was too tight, I went after it. I said, okay, let's find out how this makes sense to her, rather than saying, well, I don't know what you mean, and walking away.
Dr. Marshack, we have to close our show because we've run out of time. But I just want to mention that I believe your daughter, Bianca, is very lucky to have you as a mom. You're obviously a thinking person who is also a person of action, and I congratulate you for all your hard work and books. And we have to finalize that, so I just want to again thank our sponsors, A Major Difference, makers of Ion Cleanse. And if you'd like to find out more about Dr. Kathy Marshack, that's spelled Marshak, you can Google her and learn all about her books and contact information. Dr. Marshack, thank you for being with us today, and folks, looking forward to chatting with you again next week.